Duncan and from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. The name of my paper is Ether-Based Gravity, Electromagnetism, Quantum Mechanics, and Entanglement. My paper ties together my articles and papers that propose a physical model of the cause of gravity and a physical base of the phenomena of electromagnetism, quantum mechanics, and entanglement. The paper proposes that the medium of ether is the common element that underlies gravity, electromagnetism, quantum mechanics, and entanglement. I'm going to start by focusing on the drawing that's on the screen, and I'll give it some explanation because it's background that is useful to have in what I have to say a little later. You'll see the sun in the middle, and you'll see the earth off to the left-hand side. There are large arrows pointing at the sun, and they're colored black, and there are smaller arrows that are pointing at the earth, and they're in black. Those arrows represent inflowing ether that I contend is the cause of gravity. Obviously, the cause of gravity is a lot more complicated than that, but ether is fundamental to it. The blue arrows, the smaller arrows that are emanating from the sun outwards and are emanating from the earth outwards, are heading back into space. So, in effect, the ether theory of gravity that I propose has ether coming in from space, basically from the solar system, and outwards, the whole area, the catchment area, I'll call it, of the solar system, flowing in mainly toward the sun, as it's the main dominant reason for the flow in, but also flowing in toward the earth. And at the same time, there's outflow of ether, a different state of ether, but ether nonetheless, that heads on back ultimately into space where it condenses into the type of ether, the state of ether that flows in. That's background that is useful to have. The search for a physical concept that unifies gravity and electromagnetism is long-standing. This paper pursues that quest. It suggests that the Scottish physicist James Clerk Maxwell provided groundwork for unification in his seminal work, The Dynamical Theory of Electromagnetic Fields, published in 1865, in which he proposed a physical theory of ether upon which he based his fundamental equations of electromagnetism that are still in use today, over a century and a half later. My interest in Maxwell's dynamical theory arose when I was considering and developing ideas for a physical cause of gravity. When I read his treatise, it occurred to me that his form of ether may be viewed as a medium that has the capacity to flow, and as such, it may serve as a candidate for the cause of gravity. In result, the article cited below in the cause of gravity section of my paper set out my concept of the cause of gravity in large part based upon Maxwell's theory of ether. The proposed gravity model involves the collisional force of ether flowing into cosmic bodies, driven by the intrinsic energy of the medium of ether, much like the intrinsic energy of the medium of air drives the flow of air into an ordinary vacuum cleaner and drives the flows of our atmosphere from high pressure areas to low pressure areas. My research moved from the cause of gravity to the underpinnings of electromagnetism. It appeared to me that Maxwell's ether theory, though little used today, is in fact the best available physical cause and effect approach to electromagnetism. That is addressed in a section of my paper entitled Electromagnetism. I subsequently turned next to the apparently inexplicable phenomenon of entanglement. It too appeared to me to lend itself to an explanation based upon Maxwell's concept of ether. While I was preparing my paper on entanglement, it occurred to me that the explanation I was proposing for entanglement could in fact be the long sought-after physical foundation of the quantum mechanics theory, the physical foundation that still to this present day is missing from the quantum mechanics theory. So I expanded the scope of the entanglement paper to include the proposed explanation of the quantum mechanics theory. In the present day climate of theoretical physics, there is a significant problem in proposing concepts based upon the medium of ether. Maxwell's theory of ether, while initially having received a significant measure of acceptance, subsequently fell into disuse and even outright rejection. The Michelson-Morley experiments commencing in 1881 and similar experiments, Einstein's theory of relativity in 1905, and the advent of the quantum mechanics theory in the 1920s have been interpreted by many in the science community as establishing that ether does not exist. Yet it seems to me that some form of ether is necessary to base physical explanations of gravity, electromagnetism, quantum mechanics, and entanglement. My articles cited below argue that a medium of ether as theorized by Maxwell in fact exists and is likely the common physical underpinning of all these phenomena. I address the subject of ether specifically in the next section below. Taken as a whole, my articles propose that the medium of ether, substantially as theorized by Maxwell, unify gravity with electromagnetism, quantum mechanics, and entanglement. All these phenomena are related to the same substance, ether. In regard to gravity, inflow of condensed ether provides collisional momentum that is the direct cause of gravity. And the outflow of gaseous ether replenishes ether in space. Outflowing ether also removes heat from cosmic bodies that is caused by the collisional force of inflowing ether. Interactions of ether cells within the medium of ether cause the phenomena of electromagnetism, quantum mechanics, and entanglement. Interactions of ether cells also provide the energy, the driving force, that propels the inflow of ether that causes gravity, and the outflow that replenishes ether in space. Those are the propositions that I contend are supported by the papers that I have written in all those areas and have had published in those areas. The proposition that runs through my articles and papers is that the medium of ether permeates space and cosmic bodies. That medium consists of subatomic cells that are real substance, not mathematical constructs. The posited ether is modeled substantially on the form of ether proposed by James Clerk Maxwell in his 1865 treatise. In his work, Maxwell sets out his theory of electromagnetic fields and his equations of electromagnetism that are still in use today. His equations were based upon his posited form of ether. I'm about to go on and quote some of the passages from Maxwell's treatise. Before I do that, I wish to emphasize the point that this treatise, which is one of the most important works by any physicist in the history of physics, is the one that has been used for its equations that bring together the electromagnetic phenomena, and particularly the emission of electromagnetic radiation. So we have here, in that treatise, his equations, and we have here in this treatise his description, his physical description of the underpinnings of his equations. So his theory expounded in this treatise, his physical theory, is rather important. Now, I'll spend a moment citing from what he said as his concept, which is not simple, it covers a lot of ground, is fundamental to what I've got to say later on all the subjects that I'm addressing. He said, there is an ethereal medium filling space and permeating bodies, capable of being set in motion and transmitting that motion from one part to another, and of communicating that motion to gross matter so as to heat it and affect it in various ways. He goes on to say, the existence of a pervading medium of small but real density, capable of being set in motion and of transmitting motion from one part to another with great but not infinite velocity. Further, but when electromotive force acts on a dielectric, it produces a state of polarization of its parts, similar in distribution to the polarity of the parts of a mass of iron under the influence of a magnet. And like the magnetic polarization, capable of being described as a state in which every particle has its opposite poles in opposite directions. Further, Here then we perceive of another effect of electromotive force, namely electric displacement, which according to our theory is a kind of elastic yielding to the action of the force, similar to that which takes place in structures and machines owing to the want of perfect rigidity of the connections. This was written in 1865 by a man who was not just a scientist who worked with equations. He was a man who could describe physically what he was talking about and do it with great precision. I'll continue. The energy of electromagnetic phenomena is mechanical energy. The only question is, where does it reside? That is, the energy. It goes on. On our theory, it resides in the electromagnetic field, in the space surrounding the electrified and magnetic bodies, as well as in those bodies themselves, and is in two different forms, which may be described without hypothesis as magnetic polarization and electric polarization, or, according to a very probable hypothesis, as the motion and strain of one and the same medium. Next, it appears, therefore, that certain phenomena in electricity and magnetism lead to the same conclusion as those of optics, namely that there is an ethereal medium pervading all bodies and modified only in degree by their presence, that the parts of this medium are capable of being set in motion by electric currents and magnets, that this motion is communicated from one part of the medium to another by forces arising from the connections of those parts, that under the action of these forces there is a certain yielding depending on the elasticity of these connections, and that therefore energy in two different forms may exist in the medium. The one form being the actual energy of motion of its parts, and the other being the potential energy stored up in the connections in virtue of their elasticity. Finally, thus then we are led to the conception of a complicated mechanism capable of a vast variety of motion, but at the same time so connected that the motion of one part depends, according to definite relations, on the motion of other parts. These motions being communicated by forces arising from the relative displacement of the connected parts in virtue of their elasticity. I've just chosen parts. But these parts are very much connected to what I have to say later. So based upon Maxwell's descriptions of his form of ether, I infer that ether cells, correction, my papers and articles treat the parts and connections of Maxwell's ether as structured cells. My reasoning is that flexible structures are necessary to permit Maxwell's parts and connections to possess the key property of ether proposed by Maxwell, that being elasticity. Then I go on. Based essentially on Maxwell's description of the form of ether, I infer that ether cells have the capacity to expand and shrink, twist and untwist, vibrate and rotate, collide and rebound, attach and detach, store and transmit energy, form a medium that fills space and permeates bodies, form a medium that transmits motions and waves, collectively form patterns, polarization, interact with each other and with atomic matter. I go 2 steps further, because those I drew from Maxwell, these I infer on my own. Based on physics applicable to ordinary atoms and molecules, I infer that ether cells have the capacity to collectively flow as a fluid. Fluid mechanics will play an important part of what I have to say. Next, exist and in separate and distinct states, like atomic matter, including a gaseous state and a condensed state, probably liquid. Looking at the diagram, it's gaseous state ether that flows out from the sun, flows out from the earth, and it's liquid state droplets. In other words, collections of ether cells that flow into the earth and into the sun. That will be key in what I have to say. Maxwell's ether theory initially met with general acceptance, however, it subsequently fell into disuse. I've covered this. We've got the problems of the Michelson-Morley experiments, the advent of quantum mechanics, and Einstein's special theory of relativity in 1905. My articles contend that a medium of ether does in fact exist, substantially as theorized by Maxwell. As pointed out earlier, there are all kinds of ethers out there that various researchers, scientists have used to purposes of papers that they have written. The one I choose is Maxwell's, and it's because it's the underpinning of the his breakthrough of combining various types of radiation and bringing them under one roof and creating the equations. Seniors moment, thank you, but there will be others. My articles contend that a medium of ether does in fact exist, as per Maxwell. Experimental physics, particularly in regard to entanglement, have been based upon the premise that particle waves called quanta or photons transmit electromagnetic radiation by physically traveling from source to destination, as distinct from the ether approach of Maxwell, that electromagnetic radiation is transmitted by waves through the medium of ether. Entanglement experiments have been unable to establish any underlying physical explanation for entanglement, and have been unable to establish any underlying physical explanation for the quantum mechanics theory itself. It's a theory that has the mathematics that appear to work, but the physical underpinning has not, at least that has gained acceptance in the science community, has not yet been developed. I propose that the likely physical explanation lies in plain sight in the ether theory that Maxwell developed in 1865. Next, I make reference to two papers reconsidering Maxwell's ether and ether explanation of entanglement, which is the paper that covers both entanglement and proposes a physical underpinning for the quantum mechanics theory. Both those papers go in detail into the question of whether ether exists and what tie that ether has to electromagnetism and to the quantum mechanics theory and to entanglement. The paper now heads into these various subjects. First one is the cause of gravity. In articles that three of which have been published, and one of which I gave here 2 years ago, I proposed a conceptual model of flowing ether as the physical cause of gravity. Here's a brief summary. The gravity process is cyclic. It involves flows of ether from space into cosmic bodies and from cosmic bodies back into space. The inflowing ether and the outflowing ether are different states of ether. Outflowing ether consists of separate ether cells in a gaseous state. Inflowing ether consists of groups of ether cells that have condensed into liquid state droplets, each of which is comprised of numerous cells. This is a key proposition to the gravity theory that I propose, and I will go into that in some detail. Inflowing ether collides with matter that is in its path. The collisions push matter toward cosmic bodies. The inflowing ether, the collisions of the inflowing ether with you and me, the tables that are in this room, and with the matter of any cosmic body, those collisions, I contend, are the direct physical cause of gravity. But it's not as simple as that. Easy to assert, but there are many problems tucked into that that need to be addressed. Outflowing ether also collides with any matter in its path. However, because outgoing ether cells are considerably smaller than the incoming condensed droplets of ether, outflowing ether cells tend to pass through the matter of cosmic bodies. As we know, atoms are mostly space, and a very small portion of which is particles. Thus, the collisional force of ether on cosmic bodies is considerably greater than the collisional force exerted by outflowing ether. Visualize a fish net. You've got big fish that try to get through the net. They don't make it, or maybe some will. But generally they collide with the fiber of the net. Minnows get through the net very easily and slip right on by. Try that concept to incoming ether droplets, collections of ether cells that are attached to each other, and apply that concept to individual ether cells that flow out. This is a key part of why gravity is a one-way force, or at least gravity as we experience it. I hope that's clear. I go on to say the predominance of the collisional force of inflowing ether over the collisional force of outflowing ether explains why gravity is a one-way force. As ether flows from the expanse of space into the relatively small target of a cosmic body, the flow converges. The convergence causes the flow to accelerate. Here I rely upon Bernoulli's principle and in particular the Venturi effect. Take a look at the diagram. That incoming ether is getting closer and closer together no matter where you look. It's converging. It's converging on every angle into the earth. What happens when a fluid converges? There's no question. It accelerates, and it continues to accelerate as it converges. Food for thought as to why gravity as we know it is an accelerating force. As gaseous state ether flows through space, it condenses into liquid state ether. An analog is gaseous water molecules that evaporate from the surface of the earth and rise into the earth's atmosphere and condense into liquid droplets. This idea of two different states of ether certainly has its analog in respect of what we see in ordinary elements, molecular and atomic physics. It's a real thing that happens. If it happens there, why not with ether? As inflowing ether, in liquid state ether approaches and collides with cosmic bodies, the heat, the inevitable heat that is generated by the collisions causes the inflowing ether to evaporate, to vaporize into gaseous state ether. What causes inflow and outflow? The answer lies in the science of fluid mechanics. Substances that comprise fluids seek equilibrium of concentration. This occurs by way of diffusion. That is, the random movement of gases and liquids from areas of higher concentration to areas of lower concentration. This phenomenon of two-way diffusion of fluids. You've got the fluid of incoming ether groups or droplets, and you've got the outgoing ether cells. Do they cross each other, or do they just hammer each other and cancel gravity? Well, they cross each other. They are different types of substances. They're about as different as liquid water and ice, or as liquid water and snowflakes, or hail, or what have you. They're entirely different objects. Fluid mechanics. One of the best texts on fluid mechanics is The Introduction to Fluid Mechanics by Batchelor. He says this, page 28. Transfer of matter of a specific kind occurs in a fluid mixture, of which the composition varies with position. We may suppose that the molecules belonging to one constituent of the mixture are marked in some manner, all molecules are in continual motion of a random kind, and as a consequence have a tendency to migrate away from their initial position. Then, if at any instant the proportion of marked molecules immediately on one side of an element of surface drawn in the fluid is larger than on the other side, random migration of marked molecules in both directions across the surface element will lead in general to a non-zero flux of marked molecules across the element of such a sign as to tend to make the proportion of marked molecules more nearly equal on the two sides. This non-zero flux of a constituent of the fluid due to migration of molecules constitutes diffusion of matter. Continuing on the gravity theory, next point, in regard to inflowing ether, its level of concentration of droplets in the vicinity of cosmic bodies is constantly reduced below its level in space by vaporization of the droplets caused by collisions with cosmic bodies. In regard to outflowing ether, its level of concentration of gaseous ether cells in space is constantly reduced by condensation of its ether cells into droplets of liquid ether. Each state seeks its own equilibrium of concentration, with gaseous ether flowing into space and liquid ether flowing toward cosmic bodies. They flow through each other by diffusion and perhaps by convection, each seeking, but never reaching its own equilibrium of concentration. Again, look at the diagram. Look at the inflowing ether droplets. They hit into the sun, they hammer the sun, and they vaporize. As they vaporize, the concentration of the droplets diminishes. Probably virtually disappears because of the heat. So you have a certain concentration of the droplets in space flowing in. You have an immense drop-off of that concentration at the sun. There needs to be the seeking of equilibrium that is well known in fluid mechanics. So the bigger concentration flows toward the smaller concentration. Then consider it in reverse. The individual cells are expelled, but in space, in the coldness of space, but in space, they meet other cells, they run across whatever matter may be there, they may collide with some of the incoming ether, and they, like water vapor rising above the earth, change their composition from individual H2O molecules on Earth to conglomerations, condensed H2O groupings, I'll call them, whether that be snow, ice, or rain. And so there is a drop-off of concentration in space of the individual cells as they, in effect, condense into larger groups. So you've got that disequilibrium for the cells, far higher concentration near the sun and much lower concentration of the cells, the individual cells, as they condense in space. So you've got this disequilibrium in both directions. Ours, it's continuous, because the changes that occur on the groups of cells that arrive at the sun is continuous, and out in space, the condensation is continuous. So you've got this in and out, and it's based on very simple fluid mechanics, which addresses the question of transport of matter, of no matter what kind, but atomic matter, and in the bachelor's approach text. But nonetheless, you've got something that is continuous, and the continuity of disequilibrium keeps those flows crossing each other. Now, where is the energy that drives those flows? It lies in the constant movements of the ether cells and droplets, their collisions and rebounding, their elasticity, their vibrations within the medium of ether. It is like the energy of interacting molecules of air that push air toward a vacuum cleaner. It's as simple as that. It's a form of suction. You've got the vacuum cleaner that causes a partial vacuum within the machinery itself. It does so by sending out molecules of air, forcing them out. That lowers the concentration within the machine itself. There's the disequilibrium of the concentration in the ambient air on the one hand, and what's in the machine on the other hand. The ambient air is always in a state of molecules bumping into each other, colliding with each other. There's energy there, there's no question. But that energy pushes the air toward the vacuum cleaner. It causes
Go ahead, you're fine.
Okay.
Could you turn
It, thanks. It causes the energy in the ambient air, pushes the air toward the intake of the vacuum cleaner, because within that vacuum cleaner there's a partial vacuum caused by the machinery of the vacuum cleaner. This is exactly what I'm talking about, this disequilibrium that occurs between a cosmic body and the ether, the different types of ether, and space. Does the energy, this energy that does the pushing, run out? And my answer to that is no. To start with, the individual ether cells have absorbed heat, and when they head out toward space, they carry that heat with them. They also carry themselves with them. And the in and out does a lot toward preserving the energy in both directions. And the I here revert to the law of conservation of energy. There's always energy changing form. There's energy that is brought into the universe through stars that are burning continuously and emitting energy. The injection of energy into this milieu has got to be continuous. And if one starts with the proposition that the law of conservation of energy applies, there's every reason to think that the energy that is required to cause this process to continue is valid. Now, there are four articles that I wish to refer to. First is the cause of gravity, a concept. Second, flowing ether, a concept. Third, outflowing ether. They've all been published. And then there's a fourth article that I presented here 2 years ago, which is ether concept of gravity. Basically, that summarizes what's in those three articles that I have just referred to. They relate to the various questions about convergence, causing acceleration, different states of ether, explaining what seems inexplicable, that is, gravity being a one-way force. All the various aspects that I've gone over are explained in those articles. I move on to electromagnetism. This is fairly simple. The work's already been done for me. Thank you, Mr. Maxwell. Because it was Mr. Maxwell who said, look, this ether that I theorize exists accounts for the phenomena of electromagnetism. And it makes sense. You read that treatise, and it's just amazing what that man did, how his mind worked. But he had the theoretical side and the physical side, each backing the other up. So I don't propose to go much further than this. The paper that I wrote on the subject, which is Reconsidering Maxwell's Ether, it goes step by step into various phenomena that we associate with electromagnetism. And there's a whole list of stuff. I think around 15, 20 that I have in that paper. And each one of them lends itself to being explained by something that is happening within the medium of ether. It fits. And I can't say much more than that, because basically the idea is not mine, it's somebody else's, Mr. Maxwell's, and it may be apparent that I have a lot of respect for James Clerk Maxwell, who is the most amazing individual. So I will turn next to quantum mechanics and entanglement. Well, some time ago, I presented a paper here on entanglement. I redid the paper and in far greater detail submitted it for publication. It got published last year. It's called Ether Explanation of Entanglement. A curious title because the subject matter goes a lot further than entanglement. It attempts to give an explanation as to the quantum mechanics theory. Einstein, amongst others, and Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen wrote their paper about the missing physical aspect of quantum mechanics in 1932. It's never been answered. There have been numerous experiments carried out mainly in the entanglement area to try to find out what is going on. And they don't know. It's still up in the air. The observation I've made in going over these papers that set out the experiments and the reports on them indicate that they've all been working on the basis of photons that go from A to B. None of them, one exception, basically none of them, because the exception is just not applicable, have approached this from the point of view of Maxwell's ether theory. They don't even give lip service to the possibility that there is ether and that ether may be an underlying explanation. Well, when I go through these papers and ask myself, are the results consistent with there being an underlying ether explanation? The answer comes through loud and clear, yes. The experiments generally were of the nature, you've got a central source of power that so-called, or emits so-called photons. It's emitting something. We don't know whether they go from A to B, or whether they simply go into the collection of photons that is right there. But they make the assumption that these photons go to receptors. So you've got a receptor here, a receptor there, and the indications coming up on those receptors indicate on a probability basis that there is some connection between what receptor A is receiving and what receptor B is receiving. And it's assumed in the famous paper by Bell on Bell's inequalities that there is instantaneous communication between the receptors. Well, instantaneous communication is a tough prospect to follow. I don't think there's anybody in this room, and there are very few scientists who really believe in instantaneous communication. But that's the result of these tests, and they do not come up with a physical underlying theory for entanglement. Well, if you look at this from the point of view of Maxwell's ether, that the experiments are bathed in ether. It's all around the experiments. There, as Maxwell points out, it's not just through space, it's through material bodies as well, that this ether exists. And if you conceive that ether is there, even before the power is turned on, that ether has certain characteristics that are going to be shared between A and B. They're just in the same general area of the ether itself. The ether itself is vibrating. It has certain characteristics. They're showing up at the receptors. Also, what's showing up at the receptors is what is sent out by the power source. So you've got two things happening at the receptors, but one of them, the main one, is the ether itself, and all its characteristics are right there knocking at the doors of these receptors. Also, you've got the you've got signals coming from the power source. I suggest the signals are through the waves, through the ether medium, and the experimenters are all making the assumption that everything they're looking at is from the power source. But if you put ether in there as well, it totally changes the picture. Have any of these experiments looked at it from that point of view? No, they have not. And I suggest in this paper, with respect, that is a major flaw. And I go on in the paper, this paper, that these experiments, which have failed to show what's going on, failed to show any physical underlying basis, should be reviewed from the point of view of the experiments being in the midst of the medium of ether as conceived by Maxwell. This takes me into an area where I can see they picked up a lot of data. If they change the underlying concept and see how that data works out, maybe not, they will support the ether concept as being fundamental to those concepts, to the entanglement, and basically the fundamental explanation as to the quantum mechanics theory. In other words, gives it a physical base. Obviously, I cannot do those experiments. I do not have the mathematics or the background to be able to do that. But at the moment, those experiments miss the obvious in my submission. And I suspect in the views of people who accept the proposition that there is likely an ether, basically of the variety proposed by Maxwell, would see that there should be an approach by people who can do it to see whether what has been picked up in all those entanglement experiments, the recorded data, fit with the physical aspect that I've been trying to describe. Now, that finishes what I want to say about those three aspects, or four if we look upon entanglement and quantum mechanics as really being the same subject. Is all this pie in the sky? Or are there explanations that stop to make you think maybe it's not pie in the sky? And I'm going to advert to a few of these. There's got to be an explanation for gravity being a one-way force. I've given it a physical explanation. Has anybody got a better one? Physical? Not that I know of. There's got to be an explanation for entanglement. Have I given one? Yes, I have. Does it make sense? Does the Venturi effect make sense? In my submission, it does. There's got to be an explanation for the instantaneous appearance of instantaneous gravity between the Earth and the Sun. Well, let's look at this diagram. See where the Earth is, and see what's to the left of the Earth, pointing toward the Sun. It's that stuff that when it strikes the Earth, it's heading toward the Sun, because the Sun is the dominant target of this inflowing ether. What direction is it pointing? It's pointing directly at the sun. Well, light takes 8 point whatever minutes to get from the sun to the earth. If what we're dealing with is something that the sun emanates toward the earth, it takes 8 point so many minutes to get there. In the meantime, the earth has moved on in its orbit. Where we think we see the earth is not where the earth truly is. But if you look at it, so that calculations indicate that the force of gravity is between the sun and the earth takes place instantaneously. We've got Tom Van Flandern and others who speculate, well, we can solve that by having what goes from the sun to the earth at monster speeds beyond the speed of light. Then maybe you're getting close. You don't have to resort to that if your mindset is that gravity is in the opposite direction, is a pushing force from stuff, mainly, and I'm talking about gravity is between the sun and the earth, mainly from space flowing in, and when it hits the earth, what's its direction? Straight at the sun, and there's the direction of gravity, straight at the sun. A very simple answer that is the product of a different mindset, the product of looking at gravity as being a pushing force of inflowing ether, rather than an attractive force which can only be explained by the concept of instantaneous communication between the sun and the earth. Flows that go through each other. Is this getting a little absurd? Because I have ingoing and outgoing ether. Now, how else are you going to have the replenishment of ether in space? If it's all inflow and not outflow, it doesn't work. It's going to run down. But if you have inflow and outflow, then it starts to work. Then you've got the different states, which explain the one-way force of gravity as we experience it. Does that make sense? Is there any other way to get that one-way force if you're going to have a pushing gravity? If there is, I'm not aware of it. So, Bachelor looks at what we know, and that is that and the Bachelor refers to what we know. Fluids do flow each other. There is transport of stuff in those fluids so as that each separate component will seek its own equilibrium, which I use. Energy. Where does the energy come from? Well, atoms are vibrating all the time. If there's ether, it's fair to assume that ether cells are vibrating all the time. Atoms are bumping into each other all the time. That's what makes the vacuum cleaner work. Can that be applied sensibly to ether cells if they exist? I suggest it can. The direction of the flow. Why does a flow come toward the earth? Why does a flow come toward the sun? Because it's there that is the source of the disequilibrium. It's that disequilibrium that is key to that. yes, magnetism. Back to the magnetism part. Right? If you have ether cells and they're bumping into each other, let's see what, in all common sense, happens. Here is an ether cell in front of my face. Let's use my head as the ether cell. And I'm going to get hammered on the side of my head, and that's going to squeeze my head from one side to the other, and then it'll spring back out and hit the next door neighbor. That's pretty clear. But that's not all that happens. As my head is a rubber ball, as it gets squeezed from one side to the other, it expands all around its periphery. It has to. Do it to a rubber ball and watch what happens at the periphery. 90 degrees to that initial blow. Then ask, where is magnetism? Where does it show up in relation to electric current? It's orthogonal. It's right at 90 degrees. As that ball or cell gets struck through the middle, it expands orthogonally. What's going to happen to its neighbor? It's going to hit its neighbor. Part of that force, in other words, goes out at 90 degrees. And then you get into all the combinations and permutations, because there's going to be 45 degree, 63 degree transfers of force. But basically, there's your explanation for the orthogonal aspect of magnetism, orthogonal to electric force. Does that make sense? It does to me. And I happen to be the writer of this paper, so be it. Heat from the collisions that cause gravity. But according to Maxwell and many other luminaries of the time, before and after, the Lassalle theory of gravity would cause almost instant incineration because of the heat that it would be generating and not getting rid of. Well, gravity going on every second, all day, all those collisions have got to generate a lot of heat. All right, what happens to that heat? First of all, the volatilization of the ether droplets into individual ether cells. Just like a drop of water landing on a hot stove. And what happens to that stuff? It heads on back out into space. So you've got that equilibrium of energy, which is absolutely necessary to keep us from burning to a crisp, from gravity. Entanglement. Major proposition of entanglement is all those experiments are within the medium of ether. That just gives a physical explanation to those experiments that is not considered in the papers that I've reviewed. I hate to tell you the number. I can't say I've reviewed every one that's ever been written, but I've reviewed a lot of them. I'm going to bring this aspect to a close now by saying that there are numerous areas where if you dig into them, you find that they are in harmony with, consistent with, the type of ether as conceived by Maxwell. I want to check with you, David, about time.
You're 1 hour, 10 minutes right now.
Okay, all right. There's another aspect of the paper which goes into the science schism between electromagnetic radiation being particles or particle waves that go from A to B, or waves through a medium. It's there in my paper in some detail. I think it would take about 10 minutes for me to go through it. What do you think? Or you had enough? I don't. You're all too polite.
We have enough to think about, I think. Covered a lot.
Yeah. Well, the paper does cover a lot, there's no question. This is one aspect of the paper that I think, unless there's overwhelming, look, go for it, Duncan. I don't think there is that, because you've been very patient. But on that, I suggest you take a read of it, because I think it's pretty compelling that the advantages of waves through a medium far outweigh the advantages of a traveling particle. And all I can say is, there are the arguments. And I think with that, I should bring what I'm talking about to a close and await whatever questions you might have. So, thank you.
All right, questions?
Yes.
Busa?
Yes.
Is the mic on?
Thank you.
Yeah.
One has to appreciate the tremendous amount of thinking that you must have gone through in arriving at this model of the ether and describing how gravitation comes about. I agree with you that Maxwell's work has been and is still significant in understanding electricity and magnetism. Regarding that diagram, which explains the gravitational force of attraction between the Earth and the Sun, due to the push of other particles of the Sun towards, of the Earth towards the Sun. So those particles are coming from somewhere. Is it?
They come from space.
From space. Where? From other bodies in space?
Probably, predominantly, from the bodies that occupy our particular, I'll call it, catchment area of space. That
Okay.
is the solar system, and however far
Okay.
out it stretches.
So if the Earth and the Sun were the only bodies in the universe, there would be no gravitational force of attraction.
No,
There wouldn't be.
no, you could say almost the same thing about the Earth and the Sun and the Moon, but this ether is flowing stuff. It moves, and it can move through each other. And to say that, for example, there isn't a more powerful drawer of ether than the Sun would be wrong. There must be. And that's got to have an effect beyond just immediate bodies, but into far off bodies. There's got to be a zone between bodies, for example, between the Earth and the Moon. And spaceships, for example, they know approximately where it is, where you cross that, and you can rely on Earth's gravity to carry you back to Earth. But you've got to get a certain ways from the Moon. But there's clearly interaction. It's not as if it's a solid line. Otherwise, we wouldn't have tides, because there's clearly some interaction in that space between the sun and the moon. And I would be most surprised if there isn't a lot of interaction of these particles throughout space, throughout the universe, quite frankly.
Yes, I'm saying, suppose the sun, the earth and the sun were the only bodies in the universe.
Yeah.
Would there still be force of attraction, gravitational force of attraction between them?
You say force of attraction. You and I differ on that expression. But the one moving toward the other, one being pushed toward the other. Okay, but I think I see where your question is going.
What will be doing the pushing from?
Yeah, if there was nothing else in the universe,
Yeah.
so there's nothing else sending these particles,
We have got to the edge of the universe.
I would guess the
What
answer would
happens
be
at
no.
the edge of the universe? Well, I think that's what you're asking, and I'll endeavor to answer it.
See, because the force of gravity should depend on the bodies that are attracting each other, not on the outer bodies in the universe. If it is only the two bodies, there will still be the force of attraction. That will be the case if gravitation were a pulling force. The two bodies will pull each other, irrespective of the presence of the other bodies around. Whereas if gravitation were a pushing force, it will require the presence of other bodies to provide the particles that will do the pushing.
I think you're right. Now, your question is posed on something that is totally theoretical. All we can see out there, as far as our instruments can see, is there are other bodies, and there are other bodies, and there are other bodies. We have no idea how far the universe goes. But if you tuck yourself inside that universe and have the number of bodies, the billions and trillions and probably quadrillions of bodies that are in that universe, all working on each other, I have a lot of difficulty in answering your question based on the proposition there are two bodies only, because that's not what there is out there.
But
If
the
you
last
push me
part-
to the limit,
At the edge.
if there is an ultimate
The
edge
last
to
part
the
of
universe,
is different.
what's happening there, I don't think I can answer your question. I don't know even if there is an edge to the universe. But I'm looking at what's happening within the universe. And within the universe, there are bodies, bodies, bodies everywhere. They keep on going on and on and on. And I think
It would
it's
expand.
fair to start from that premise.
Universe.
Well, as I said, I really appreciate your thinking and arriving at that. It has provided a lot of food for thought. Well
Thank you.
done.
Thank you. Listen.
You got, somebody else wants to make a comment?
Cameron,
Yeah, there it is,
Thank you. But first of all, I get approval from all of you in terms of time. Can I continue the question?
Well, ask a question, but please don't
Yeah,
expound upon your own theory, okay?
Yeah.
No.
So ask a question, then
We need to keep the discussion to this topic for now, because we're gonna be wrapping it up in 15 minutes.
Okay. It seems you told me that ether has elasticity.
Is it what?
Elasticity?
Yes.
Yeah. I agree with that too.
Yeah.
And as far as your inflow and outgoing ether flow, you said they avoid each other, even if they are in the opposite direction. It will not affect the momentum. But the thing is, and they have to come in, the inflow and outgoing either has to come in contact with each other. Otherwise, they don't know why and how to avoid each other. But if they come in contact, and how can they preserve their original momentum?
Okay, I got your question. All right, and basically this. I'm sure everybody has heard about the mean free path principle or phenomenon. And that is, this is what underlies a substance of greater concentration moving toward an area of lesser concentration. They are bumping into each other continuously, but because there is lesser concentration in one place, each bump, on average, in that direction will be a little longer until it hits a neighbor than in the bumps in the other direction, because there's more concentration to worry about here, less concentration to worry about here, and the mean free path describes that phenomenon. On average, you go on average, each particle will go a little further in the direction of lesser concentration. Does that meet your question? I hope so.
Okay, that's a little further.
Okay. See the microphone, please.
Oh,
Just a little further. With your concept, can it be lead to calculation that shows that equation form like a Newton's gravitational equation?
yeah.
It can?
No, I haven't got the question yet. Can you try?
Okay, with your idea,
Yeah.
can it lead to a calculation that it can establish an equation in the form of the Newton's gravitational equation?
Okay, thank you. I can't answer your question. I would imagine that it would be very close, but the question can also be asked, will it meet Einstein's approach, which is different, and on the periphery, but it's different. And will it meet his? I do not have the mathematics to answer that question. And it could well be that if someone does have the mathematics, they can say it fits Newton most of the time, but on the periphery, it fits Einstein. But I can't, other than that, I can't answer your question. I don't have the equipment.
Duncan, your ether is there whether there's bodies or not, is it not? The ether exists, correct? You don't need these bodies for the ether to exist. In regard to Moose's question, whether there's one body or a zillion bodies,
Yeah.
there's ether there, and each body is going to feel a gravitational force from the inflow and outflow, correct?
Well, he restricted his question to there being two bodies in the whole universe. And I have difficulty in fitting that into my mind, but because what it does is push me out to the edge of the universe, if there is an edge to the universe. But otherwise, what you're getting at, Ray, is there is ether everywhere. It permeates. And what it is at the edges of the universe, I don't know. And we there get into a question that I don't think anybody knows. How far does it go? Does it have an end? Is it infinite? Who knows? But have I met your question?
If I take the Earth out of your diagram, the sun still has its gravity.
Yes.
It doesn't need the Earth for its gravity. So whether there's one body in the universe, or like I say, a zillion, each one of those bodies is going to have gravity because the ether does not depend upon the existence of bodies.
I'm not sure, because...
Well, the ether is not generated from, the sun doesn't generate the ether.
Oh, yes,
It flows and it outflows, but it's not the source of ether.
Yeah, well, it may or may not be a source of ether, that I don't know. We get into a complicated question there of what makes up matter? Is ether something that actually in its own way form matter? Is ether another name for electron? What?
Well, I can see the sun being formed from ether, but I don't see the sun being that which creates the ether itself. The ether is there, and if it coagulates or does whatever it does, it may form matter. But whether the ether is, under your hypothesis, the ether is there, whether there's any suns or earths or anything. There's always ether. It's not a vacuum.
I work from that hypothesis, that's right. Anything else?
Please.
I have one more question, which is, I really don't understand your, and how entanglement is explained by your theory, because you just said that you've explained it because the ether exists in all parts of the experiment, so I get that, but there's no reason why that should force the correlation that we're seeing in these experiments. I just don't see any reason why that would be forced by that.
If ether is there, it's knocking at the door all the time of the receptors, whether the power is on or off. It has characteristics, and those characteristics are hitting the receptors all the time. The characteristics of the stuff emitted from the power sources are too. What the experiments assume is that all the stuff hitting the receptors is from emitted photons. Totally ignore the fact that not only is the ether at the receptors, but it has common characteristics, and those are striking the receptors.
It would hit it randomly.
Yes.
So I don't see that would be contributing to the correlation that they're seeing in the entanglements. I mean, all of that stuff is true.
Yeah.
I mean, there's ether between the experiments. It's constantly feeding in the sensors.
Yeah.
But when they experiment, they're like looking for a spin or something, and they see a left spin in one thing, so they immediately know there's a right spin in the other one. And any random effects from the ether, I don't see forcing, when they see a left on sensor A, that it forces sensor B to be a right, because I still just don't see how the random action of the ether could possibly force that kind of thing in your mind. I mean, in your mind, you seem to think that, yeah, that totally explains why when I see a left here, there's a right over there. But I totally don't see it.
Well, I don't know if I can make you see it, but if it's there, then it has certain common characteristics. And those common characteristics are striking the receptors. Common characteristics and correlation with the same animal. And if that is one of the substantial aspects of looking at this through the eyes or concept of Maxwell's ether, there are common characteristics that give the impression that they go from one receptor to another, but they don't. They're already there. And that is so, all this is based on probability. You won't always get the same characteristic knocking on this door as on that door, but you will get a certain level, proportion. And all I'm saying is this is a significant contributor, and it's not taken into account. And when you do take it into account, it's simply there. There's no need for any instantaneous communication between the receptors. Now, that's the best I can do at the moment. One thing I would suggest is that particular paper, which is probably the most difficult one I've ever written. It's not this one. This one was a compilation of stuff I've done. But that one on Aether concept of entanglement is probably the most difficult I've ever done. And if you want to get a grasp of what I'm getting at there, I think you need to read that paper. It's very difficult to summarize the whole thing in a few sentences.
Yes, please.
And if you want a copy, I've got it here, but you can get it on my website, which is duncanshaw.ca. Yes?
Yeah, the ether flow
Yeah.
is all towards the sun.
Well, mostly toward the sun, yeah.
Yes.
Predominantly.
Is it uniform around the sun? Is it uniform?
I would assume it's relatively uniform. The reason I hesitate is that that flow is going by all the planets on the way to the sun, and I would think that the existence of those planets in the path would reduce absolute uniformity to something less. But generally, I would assume that it's uniform.
The same thing with the earth. The ether flow toward the earth. The same thing with the earth. The ether flow toward the earth is also uniform.
Generally so, but we're moving into another area. And for example, the Michelson-Morley experiments, all of which have been done on the Earth. Well, we don't know whether the Earth is cocooned to quite an extent, which would reduce the readings taken on the Michelson-Morley and similar experiments. Think of this. You're in a car. You're driving at 100 miles an hour. And it's not a convertible. You're inside. And that car is feeling the brunt of all the air you're plowing through. How much are you feeling? None. Why? Because you're protected by the car that surrounds you. Are we protected by the high concentration of ether that surrounds the Earth? Is some of the pushing, for example, of the ether that's flowing toward the sun being absorbed above the surface of the Earth? And there's a theory of cocooning which is yes, and that explains why the readings on the Michelson-Morley and similar experiments are not up to what people expected them to be. And have I wandered off your question? I'm not sure, Musa.
No, you answered it. That the flow is uniform around the sun and around the earth, more or less uniform.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, if it were not uniform, then the force of gravity on the earth will depend on its position around the sun. If the flow of ether toward the sun, if it were not uniform, then the force of gravity would depend on the position of the earth around the sun.
What do you mean, closer to or further from the
No,
sun?
in between the same distance.
Yeah.
Because in one direction there will be more flow than in another direction.
Yeah.
But you say it's uniform. So it will depend on the distance, not on the direction of which the Earth is.
To depend on the distance from.
From the Earth, from the Sun. The photogravity will depend on the distance from the Sun,
Okay,
not on the direction in which it is.
Okay, I would think that is a factor, probably minuscule, but maybe not, that would make a difference.
That's a if question.
Yeah.
Any more questions and comments? Well, I think we're ready for lunch. Thank you very much.